On August 13th, 1981, a man named Andrew Dawson would enter a hardware store. Rather than look for tools or supplies, he'd look for cash. After approaching the owner of the shop, 91-year-old Henry Walsh, he'd pull out a knife and attempt a robbery. However, Henry would refuse to tell him where the money was located. After a few moments, Andrew would tie a rope around the shopkeeper's neck to force the information out of him. Despite being strangled, Henry would still refuse to say anything. Becoming furious, Andrew would stab the elderly man in the chest several times. From here, he would hang his body on a coat hook, leaving blood spilling out onto the shop floor. In the end, Henry would receive 11 stabs to his chest. With his final stab, Andrew would use so much force that the blade would exit through Henry's back and penetrate the wood behind him. Later, it would be discovered that Henry also had a fractured jaw. Andrew would take a pension book and then leave Henry to slowly die. In the days following this, concerned neighbors would report that Henry was missing to police. Upon entering his shop, they would find his body tortured and mutilated. Andrew would eventually be arrested for the murder and receive life in prison. While locked away, he would continuously compare himself to other infamous serial killers, saying that he could do a better job than them. Born in 1962 in England, he shared his poverty-stricken house with 5 other siblings. Even at a young age, Andrew would display sociopathic behavior, stealing from other children around the neighborhood. As a teenager, this would evolve to breaking into houses and stealing property. Eventually, his own brother would report his criminal activity to the police, which resulted in the arrest of Andrew. 6 months later, he would be released and return to his criminal ways. This led all the way up to the murder of Henry Walsh. Andrew would be released 19 years later on parole in 1999. In the years following this, he would move away, get married, have 2 children, and soon settle down. However, his heavy drinking would soon result in a divorce and the loss of his children in 2003. After this, he would return to prison 3 times for being drunk and disorderly, weapons charges, and breaking curfew. During 2009 and early 2010, he'd find residence in several locations but be evicted at one point for assaulting the landlord. Only a few weeks after Andrew moved into this apartment, the co-workers of an elderly neighbor of his would contact police. This neighbor's name was John Matthews. Co-workers were concerned that the 66-year-old man hadn't shown up for work in weeks. On July 25th, police would enter John's residence where they would find him dead. Initially, they would conclude that he had taken his own life. However, during the autopsy, stab wounds would be discovered and his death would be ruled a homicide. Later on, it would be found that on July 10th, Andrew had knocked on the door of John Matthews. John would open the door only to find Andrew asking to use his washing machine, claiming that his was broken. John, allowing him to do so many times before, would allow Andrew into his house. At some point after this, Andrew would pull out a knife and violently stab the man in the chest 18 times. With blood pooling on the ground, he would then remove John's clothing and then redress him to conceal the stab wounds. From here, he would drag the corpse through the house, place it into the bathtub, and then fill it up with water. The reason he did this was to hide the smell of decay from the nearby neighbors. Doing this would also speed up the rate of decomposition. After the murder, Andrew would leave the apartment and then return to his own residence. There, he would take his 2 kids, who he was watching, outside as if nothing had happened. The next day, he would return to John's house, using rags to clean up the crime scene. John Matthews' body would be left to rot in the water for weeks. Once he was found, Andrew would immediately be suspected. However, he would be nowhere to be found. As a manhunt ensued, police would force their way into his home, finding the entire apartment smelled of bleach. On July 30th, Andrew would be spotted in Whitehaven, Cumbria. During this time, police would begin to check on other neighbors in Andrew's apartment complex. There they would find that 58-year-old Paul Hancock could not be located. After realizing this, they would force their way into Paul's home, finding his body in the bathtub. Like John, Paul had been stabbed to death. With this victim, Andrew had stabbed him 22 times. Paul had received these stab wounds to his neck and chest. He had most likely used the same excuse as he did with John, claiming that he needed to use the washing machine. Following the murder, Andrew would drag Paul's body to the bathtub and then fill it with water and bleach to hide the smell. He would then dump all the weapons and evidence into the tub. With this crime scene, he would be in a rush due to police investigating the disappearance of his first victim. Soon, it was realized by police that Andrew was in Paul's apartment when they first discovered the body of John. They had spoken to him, asking if he'd seen the elderly man. It is unknown if he was committing the murder or if he was cleaning up the crime scene. Regardless, it was after this encounter that Andrew fled, making his way onto a train and heading off to Whitehaven. 5 days later, he would be found by the ocean, sleeping on a bench. Upon approaching him, he would jump into the sea and swim away. Luckily, he would be tased and then subdued by authorities. 7 knives would be found in his backpack. After searching his apartment, police would find a letter of confession in a notebook. Part of the letter would read, "To the head of homicide, I want to confess a murder. I stabbed a man to death." He would later go on to sign the letter, "The Angel of Mercy." Furthermore, while investigating one of the victim's apartments, police would find a rubber glove in the bathtub with the dead body. This rubber glove would have the tip missing from one of the fingers. After searching the apartment for weeks, they would finally find the missing piece of the glove. Later, they would discover this evidence contained the DNA of Andrew. Out of all the evidence found, this would be the crucial evidence needed to place him at the scene of the crime. During the interrogation, Andrew would admit that both men were nice and he didn't want to kill them. However, he also stated that he suddenly had an overwhelming urge to do so and that he felt as if he had to. Police would find no motive beyond this. By July of 2011, Andrew would change his story, stating that he was innocent of the murders and would plead not guilty. However, only a few hours later, he would get bored during court and once again plead guilty. After considering his first murder at the age of 18, the judge would sentence Andrew Dawson to life in prison.